Christ is risen.
Indeed he is risen.
Hello and welcome to tonight's public lecture entitled Cost of Compromise, the concluding portion of a three-part lecture series, Byzantium's Untold Story, hosted by St. Photios, Orthodox Theological Seminary. For those of you who are joining us live on the seminary's YouTube channel, welcome. I'd like to remind everybody that following the presentation, we will have the concluding question and answer session, and all of you that are joining us online are encouraged and invited to send in your questions to ask@spots.edu by email. Again, that's sending an email to ask@spots.edu. For those of you who are joining us here live, I would again remind and ask that you take a moment to silence your cell phones. Before we move on with the introduction, I would like to ask Archimandrite Photios to say the opening prayer.
For Christ of pure life, blessed and sanctified, so man cometh into the world, to like the counsel of Son of Christ, enemies the unapproachable light of God, so doing thy commandments, faith to the that all matter and mother of all thy saints. Amen.
Thank you, Father. Once again, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Mateusz Ferens, the presenter for Byzantium's Untold Story lecture series. Having graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts in Applied Design from San Diego State University, followed by a Master's in Art History from the University of California, Riverside, where his major was Early Modern, Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Art and Architecture, Mateusz is now a PhD candidate at the Department of Art History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As his primary interest, Mateusz studies the art and visual cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. He teaches broadly on topics related to the history of art, science, and visual culture, as well as religious studies and cultural theory. He is currently writing his dissertation on the transition of the Eastern Mediterranean and specifically of Byzantine culture to early modernity. Mateusz is a much valued member of the faculty here at the seminary, bringing a decade of teaching experience, having taught numerous courses in addition to the seminary at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Edwidge College, a private university in Madison, Wisconsin. At the seminary, which has been blessed to have Mateusz as one of its most dedicated fellow workers, basically from the seminary's very founding, in addition to teaching, Mateusz has brought considerable administrative talents in helping with program organization, curriculum development, and ongoing institutional assessments. Mateusz has a number of publications which include Dionysius of Furna, Artistic Identity Through Visual Rhetoric, published by the Center for Traditionalist Orthodox Studies here in Etna, California, and is a gifted speaker, having been invited to present at numerous conferences, and as we have all witnessed these past 2 days. The Byzantium's Untold Story lecture series focuses on unmasking some of the controversy over the Byzantine struggle for survival. First, in the lecture titled Barbaric Transmission, that was held on Sunday, Mateusz shared how the representation, or rather the misrepresentation of Byzantine decline by influential historians continues to influence our understanding and conversations. Yesterday, in the lecture titled Mortal Conflict, Mateusz explored who participated in the ransacking of Byzantine culture beyond the Latins and the Turks, and why this can change our view of Byzantine history. If you weren't able to join us live, recordings for both of these lectures are available on the seminary's YouTube channel under the Live tab. I would encourage you to take a moment and view them. Tonight, in the concluding lecture, Cost of Compromise, Mateusz will cover what were the key survival strategies that were adopted and what was the cost of compromise to the Byzantines as they struggled to preserve their culture. The hope is that this lecture series will enable us to learn to cherish our Orthodox past while facing the harsh realities of Byzantine history. without any further ado, please join me in welcoming tonight's presenter, Mateusz Ferens. Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here as always, and I'm very glad that we all made it to the third session today. If you had attended the first one or had seen the recording of it, you'll remember that I started the lecture with telling you a little bit about my interest in Byzantine studies. I read Count Belisarius by Robert Graves, which is a fantastic book in my opinion. I was faced almost immediately at that time with needing to reconcile how an emperor like Justinian, who we consider a saint, could have led also to the blinding of his most devoted and most loyal general, who was the hero of the story and still is a hero to me. This was not a story that dissuaded me from the study of Byzantium, but rather encouraged me to study it even more, to reconcile what seemed to be an odd paradox. And so I realized after much study that those two men acted in service of an empire. It needed to happen because generals were consistently a threat to the imperial rule, even with a general like Belisarius, who was dedicated fully to his emperor. And so they both compromised in the sense of they both needed to let something go. A friendship on behalf, that's what Justinian had to let go of, and a devoted and trusted general. And Belisarius ended up devoting his body. He was blinded and never said a bad word about his emperor thereafter. And so these were true heroes in the sense of the Byzantine history. They both sacrificed something that was needed for the preservation of the empire. This is one of the things that was lacking in the 13th century of the history that I described, people willing to sacrifice friendships and sacrifice their own bodies on the line for the empire. And so I wanted to start today by saying that I learned to love the subject of my study, not because I fell in love or somehow romanticized the glorious parts of it, but because, or I should say, through and despite the ugly sides of it. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the people who, in the midst of what was becoming a norm, of the dissolution of their culture, and a lot of compromises on either side in terms of compromises of faith, art, which we're going to focus on today a lot, the merging what scholars today call the hybridity of Latinizing and Byzantinizing styles together, which is a kind of a compromise on the aesthetic front. We're going to look at how certain individuals handled this situation and how they attempted to either reconstitute or to somehow preserve some of their traditions. And so the plan for today is to look at a few examples. I'm going to look at St. Simeon of Thessaloniki from the beginning. That's going to be a short example. We're also going to look at an anonymous work of art, the Dormition of St. Ephraim, that comes to us from Crete. And then the person who was the subject of my master's thesis, Dionysius of Furna. In the end, I will say a few things about what I can call perpetual siege of Constantinople. Just a few words, given the fact that today is a special day, because today on the old calendar is May 29th. On the Julian calendar, which is the same one that the Romans followed, and today commemorates therefore the siege of Constantinople. And I thought it was appropriate to also include a few words on that particular image that we see here also from Moldavia. We will begin today's lecture by looking at an interesting image that comes to us from Italy. This is the church of the Santa Maria in Vallicella. It's called the Small Valley. and is located in Rome. This is the new church, the Chiesa Nuova, that was built over a much smaller church and much older church that dates all the way back to when, before the schism between the East and the West. When the new church was going to be built, the monastery that was in charge, or the abbot that was in charge of this monastery, had a problem because part of the wall, there was a fresco on the wall of the older church that was considered miracle working, and so they needed to preserve it. So what they did is they cut that piece of wall and included it in part of the new church. They then commissioned Peter Paul Rubens in 1608 to paint this magnificent Baroque facade over the wall, and there's a hatch right over here over the centerpiece. This is a removable hatch that comes off once in a while, and behind it we can see the original fresco, the miracle working of the Theotokos, the Nicopoeia, the victory bringer. Hans Belting, who is a very eminent art historian, uses this example to talk about the change in attitudes in the West about art. His book focuses on the transition from the era of the image, as he calls it, to the era of art. And the idea is that at some point in Europe, there's a major shift in the production of artists, whereas the era of the image belongs to an era where the artists themselves, nobody knew their name, they worked on behalf of a community, of a patron, and the work of art was not the same prior to this moment and after this moment. But the transition happened in all kinds of small ways, and it's very difficult to pinpoint a single point at which this shift happened. But as a few notable points in history, this one for him marks one of those important moments in which the West shifted its mindset with regard to imagery. The reason why I wanted to use this particular image is because we have something of an equivalent in the Orthodox sphere. This is the monastery of Latadon in Thessaloniki. And in this monastery, in the museum of that monastery, they have a large icon. And this is a very interesting icon because it's in fact two icons, one embedded into the other. The icon right here in the middle, which is a small icon, comes to us from, as you see over here in the description, perhaps you can read it, from the 14th century. It predates the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. The larger framing portion was painted at the very end of the 15th century, maybe a decade or so after the fall of Constantinople. If you look at the styles, the style remains as much as possible the same. There is a difference, however, which is an invisible difference, because this is in fact utilizing new material, a piece of canvas to paint on that was glued onto a board. So the world is changing, but the idea is that as the world changes, these iconographers are trying as much as possible to insist on continuity. They even repeat the image of Christ and the angel in the top register, very similarly to the way that relics, if you've ever seen reliquaries, they very often repeat the imagery. If it's a relic of a hand, usually a depiction of a hand occurs on the reliquary. Reliquaries tend to somehow represent that which is hidden inside, the particular body part, mimic it outside. And so just in the same way that the Madonna di Vallicella treated the old fresco as a relic of the past, here we also see this smaller icon treated as a relic, but as a live and living relic, one that is repeated and extended into the new icon. There is not that transition that we see in the West. On this note, I'd like to point out that the history of the East and West ends up going into two different directions. We eventually have printmakers in the West, Albrecht Dürer, who's probably the more famous, but there are many others who are very excellent printmakers. At some point, the monks on Mount Athos begin to make their own prints, carving things out of wood blocks. And they never produced somebody like Dürer. And I wanted to use this as an example to point out that the intention was never to produce a Dürer. If we start to look at modernity and start to evaluate the East based on the accomplishments of the West, the East will always be found behind the times, lacking in quality, and the list can go on, right? But I want to point out right from the beginning of this lecture that the two were on very different trajectories. What was important to one culture, or if we can call it a single culture, was not the same as what was important to the other culture, especially one that was put into a mode of survival. So with the first example that we're going to study today, St. Simeon of Thessaloniki, this is going to be a fairly quick example, but I think one that begins a series of what we can call the archival mode. I wanted to say a few things about this term, archival mode. It's used very much in the West, and it's not quite applicable. It is anachronistic, I would say, if we apply it to the East, especially at this time. But what we see, and what we will see with people like St. Simeon of Thessaloniki, is people who are looking back at what they are starting to lose and be seriously concerned with preserving that which they lose. St. Simeon became bishop of Thessaloniki at a time when Thessaloniki was under siege by Ottoman forces, and the city was besieged by Ottomans virtually his entire time as a bishop. In fact, he died in 1429, and the city of Thessaloniki was finally conquered by Ottomans or just 2 years later in 1431. He was one of the leaders who defended the city. The citizens of Thessaloniki wanted to give the city over to the Latins, to Venetians, and he was the one who protested that. Stay strong in your faith was his claim. Forces from Constantinople were not forthcoming, and so eventually the governor of the city did, in fact, hand over the keys to Westerners, hoping that they are going to call in reinforcements and save the city. In the meantime, however, as he was busying himself with the defense of the city and encouraging the citizens of Thessaloniki, he also wrote many treatises. He was extremely productive in that way. These treatises, among the various treatises that he wrote, some of them have to do specifically with codification of Orthodox life. He wrote, for example, a treatise on prayer. He also wrote an explanation of the services conducted in the Orthodox Church. He goes into details explaining what the priest's cuffs symbolize, what they're meant for, and so on and so forth. In fact, those of you who are familiar with the small book by Paweł Florensky called Iconostasis, that book is predicated on the explanation of the iconostasis that St. Simeon provides for us. What St. Simeon knew what was going to happen is there's going to be a time, very soon probably, in which Orthodox Christians are going to need to reconstitute their own understanding of orthodoxy. And he prepared for that moment, and he started to codify it. The codification itself was not necessarily something that was done before, not in that same way. Previously, perhaps, I don't want to make too exaggerated of a point of this, but previously perhaps their writers were embedded in some kind of theological polemic, and so wrote in order to explain certain realities. Here, however, the intention is specifically to put something into a portable format so that at some point in the future it can be resurrected and to reconstitute a culture and a faith. And from that we see the beginnings of what I'd like to call the archival mode, which is, in fact, like I said, it's kind of a modern term to apply. And I want to make sure that you understand that I'm not trying to say that the archival mode applies equally to the east and to the west and to the east. They are two very different modes in themselves. So I'm trying to identify what it looks like in the east. So in the next example over here, we're going to focus on an interesting icon that comes to us from the Byzantine and Christian Museum in Athens. And this is the 15th century icon of the Dormition of St. Ephrem that comes to us from Crete. It possibly predates the fall of Constantinople itself, but we have to remember that Crete at this time had already been several centuries under Venetian colonial rule. It had never been recovered by the Romans. So this comes to us from already a kind of a diaspora, already under a kind of a colonial existence. The interesting thing about this icon is something that I'll point out to you, is that there's a mystery as to what all these monks are doing in this particular icon relative to the Dormition of St. Ephrem. I'll show you a couple of icons here. You will see that this is the Dormition of St. Onufrius, comes to us from a little bit later, from the 15th to the 16th century. This one's located at the Byzantine Museum. And you will notice that the saint has changed, but virtually everything else about this icon remains the same. So too in this icon, the Dormition of St. Savas. The saint has changed. Some of the details might be a little bit different, but the composition remains essentially the same. And we have many, many such examples. Here's Dormition of St. Athanasius in a chapel in Mount Athos. There are fresco versions of this, and so on. To emphasize the point about this exchangeability of the saint, this icon itself was for a very long time in museums labeled as the Dormition of Agios Isidros. In fact, the inscription reads as much in white paint. Only later, at some point, somebody who studied this very closely realized that in red letters, behind it, something very faded, something that the artists themselves did not notice, was an inscription that identified this as Saint Ephrem of Syria. And so when we look at this figure over here, we realize that there is nothing really in this icon that identifies the saint as that particular saint, to the point where they could easily be confused as to the identity of the saint itself. And none of these figures pertain to the life of the saint itself. Obviously, if we saw the compositions being the same compositions with other saints, none of these pertain to those particular saints. And so it implies a certain kind of an exchangeability of the what should be the focal subject of the icon itself. And so what is the real subject of this icon? If we focus on the background can be identified as coming to us from many different sources, and they all pretty much come from manuscript illuminations. For this figure over here can be identified in multiple manuscripts in which figures are carving spoons. These are monks doing all kinds of things that monks do. This happens to be the manuscript containing the Heavenly Ladder of St. John Climacus. In other manuscripts, we have, for example, this manuscript of the Penitential Canons, which includes a description of monks' lives. And this is part of the narrative of Varlam and Yoasaph, in which Varlam describes the monks' lives. So also in general, we have depictions of monks living in caves, and this interesting depiction of the repose of a monk. Again, a penitential canon. This particular one comes to us from the Vatican Library Codex 1754. And the inscription above says, "Unto you who sorrow and lament in mutual anguish, I will now become a good angel. For the Lord, who loveth mankind and is merciful, hath heard the prayer of us poor ones, and hath wiped out our transgression forever. Wherefore my heart now leapeth for joy." So these are obviously the kinds of manuscripts that are intended to be read while a monk is reposing. For example, this Vatican Codex 394, and depictions of monks who are reposing with icons too, so perhaps this is partly where that icon comes from, though it can't be the only reason. This is the Orologion of the Archimeton monastery, and it includes the Akoluthia, the service for those who are dying. Again, it does not correspond with the central subject of the icon. The icon is a saint. This is not to be a commemorative element. The other problem too is, strictly speaking, in Orthodox understandings of icons, we depict a saint as the saint appears at that time in a state of anticipating deification, in a state of already foretasting the heavenly glory, right? So stepping out of time, and we only really represent the saint in these kind of temporal settings, in manuscripts or in areas where we are representing their lives. So for example, Saint Ephrem here represented, I reversed this image just to kind of mirror the saint, the direction of the saint in the icon itself, but this is a manuscript illumination corresponding to the life of Saint Ephrem. So this is where we tend to see things associated with the saint's actual life, and especially the repose. This brings us to a question and several problems. First of all, the dormition of a saint, it does not fit with the commemorative services from where all these other elements come from. And the penitential canons and the text of Saint John Climacus that are used to inspire the outer portions. It also doesn't fit with the understanding of a timeless representation of the saint. And the fact that what they're doing is that they're transferring from one medium to another. They're taking what belongs in manuscript form and they're turning it into an icon. This, in fact, is a kind of putting into iconographic form. In fact, this is putting into a venerable form the life of the monks, the proper life of the monks. What is happening at this time in 15th century Crete and thereafter is a kind of an attack on the monasticism itself that the monks are feeling, because they are now forced to compromise heavily on their monastic lifestyles. Especially in Ottoman territories, but also in Venetian territories, they are no longer supported by emperors like they used to be supported financially. They are now instead being taxed. And this leads a lot of monastic communities to disband. And idiorhythmic monasticism takes over. This is the form of monasticism where the monks live pretty much outside of the monastery, very loosely connected to each other as a mode of survival. And Cenobitic monasticism, that's the monasticism that they all stay together and live together in one place, pretty much is no longer feasible. It's no longer, they're no longer to live that type of a life. And as you can imagine, monasticism itself starts to undergo an identity transformation. And at this point, the monks, acknowledging this major dissolution of monastic life, are starting to preserve it and codify it in a form that we see here, and that becomes the stable element, the stable iconographic element that stays the same, icon over icon, fresco representation through fresco representation, where the saints change, but the operative element stays the same, stays constant. And we can therefore identify that as the behind-the-scenes true subject of this icon. It also, the saint, of course, is necessary because there needs to be a saint. You cannot just put lives of the monks and then venerate this type of an icon. But at the same time, when we see what is really going on in the historical context, we understand that they are trying to preserve something that's very dear to them. With regard to Dionysius of Furna, who I'd like to move to in the next portion here, Dionysius of Furna lived in the early 18th century. So this is around the 1700s and quite late. By this time, monasticism or the monastic communities on Mount Athos have undergone severe amounts of either persecution or heavy taxation, where they had to sell off a large portion of their goods. And they sold them off to people who took them then to the west or north to Russia, and they tried to preserve themselves as best as possible. This is also a time when they had needed to disband, move into an idiorhythmic type of a lifestyle. And around the 18th century, because the Ottoman Empire started to weaken, and especially because the Ottomans had suffered several major defeats that led to the treatises of Karlovitz and Pasarovitz, in which the Ottomans had to concede to Western powers certain rights and protections for people and territories and so on. Because of that weakening element of the Ottoman Empire, things became a little bit easier for the Orthodox, and this is when we start to see monks start to return back to the monasteries. And at this point, monks start to repair their own churches that had gone into complete abandonment prior to that, and needing to paint their own churches. Prior to this, in for example, what we call Byzantine times, monks typically did not paint their own churches. There were groups of traveling, usually family-related groups of painters, and they were hired by monasteries to paint churches. Monks did not paint. They needed to now pick up the brushes themselves and start applying paint to the walls and paint themselves. Well, how to do that? In the midst of this, they are cut off from those Orthodox Christians that live outside of Ottoman territories. So I'm comparing here in front of you two different paintings, one by Dionysius of Furna and one by a contemporaneous painter who painted at the same time as Dionysius did, but that go in two very different directions. This is, of course, the same subject, St. John the Baptist. On the left, as painted by Dionysius of Furna, on the right, as painted by Panayotis Doxaras. Panayotis Doxaras lived on the west coast of modern-day Greece, and so he founded also what's called the Heptanesian school, and this is a school of painting that prioritized imitation of Western forms, the three-dimensional modeling of the human body, realistic depiction of the background, and eventually they also did away with things like gold background. They really tried to imitate Western forms as much as possible. Both of these painters also produced important written work. Dionysius of Furna wrote his Irminia, which is the interpretation of the art of painting, in which he ended up explaining to his readers, who were artists, what it takes to be a real artist, who to follow, and what kind of, how to mix paints together. And then he follows up with a very encyclopedic explanation or a list of how to paint all the different saints, all the different feast days of the church, how to arrange the different feast days and the different portions in the church. He tried as much as possible to codify everything that there is to be about Orthodox painting. And this is he's doing for these monks who are now starting to pick up brushes on their own. Panayotis Doxaras also wrote a manual for painters, but he advocated the very opposite. Whereas Dionysius of Furna says, if you cannot find a good teacher, emulate the paintings of Manuel Panselinos, who was a supposed figure dating all the way back to the late 13th century and had painted magnificent frescoes. I will show you an example of it in the Protaton Church in Carias on Mount Athos, so accessible to Dionysius. And he says, look at these examples and follow them. So he is sometimes referred to as a traditionalist because he's telling his students, his readers, to follow those examples. Panayotis Doxaras does the opposite, where he translated Leonardo da Vinci's Trattato della Pittura, that is to say the treatise on the art of painting, and advocates as much as possible to follow the models of the West. So we have two painters who at the same time produced two manuscripts advocating for two very opposite trajectories in Orthodox art. Prior to this, we saw a transformation among Orthodox painters, and we see that even in the lifetime of a single painter like Dominicus Theotokopoulos, also known as El Greco, the Greek in the West, because he indeed moved to the West at some point. First he painted on Crete. He painted he painted in what is known the Cretan style. And this Byzantinizing icon is something that we would recognize, as I had mentioned before. We would accept this into any church without probably a blink of an eye. Eventually, we see a little bit of a transformation. This is his depiction of the adoration of the Magi. So two things have changed. One, the style has slightly changed. And also, at the same time, the subject has changed. The subject itself is not one that we encounter in what we call Byzantine artistic culture. We see him, as many Cretan painters at that time, be capable of painting in one style and another style. And in fact, the Venetian market for art demanded very often from Cretan painters to paint, let's say the painters received an order, paint 400 icons in the Byzantine style, the maniera greca as they said, and 200 icons in the maniera latina. So the icon painters were versatile and were able to switch from one to the other. Eventually, somebody like El Greco moves to the West, and at this point, he completely transforms his mode of painting. He ends up developing his own style of painting, and so at that point, he really does not represent any particular movement necessarily, but it goes off in an idiosyncratic direction. A person who around the same time went in the opposite direction is Theophanes of Crete, who also grew up on Crete, who also started to paint on the island of Crete, but he moved instead to mainland Greece, made his way to Mount Athos, together with his sons, became monks, and especially in the monastery of Stavronikita, he painted, again, frescoes more and more in what we can call traditional style at that time. If you are wondering, at the time of Dionysius of Furna, what did the monks themselves produce? I mean, these people who didn't actually paint, but now needed to paint for themselves, well, they started to paint things like this. This comes from the Skiti of St. Anne on Mount Athos. This represents St. Macarius the Roman. And what we see is heavy use of line. They are going almost in the complete opposite direction of naturalism. They are trying to make their style as severe as possible. Very harsh use of lines, very bold brush strokes, and so on. Dionysius of Furna, his painting here of St. Luke is on the left. Manuel Pansilinos, centuries before, somebody who lived in the late Byzantine period, as I said, in the late 13th century, is represented here with a fresco of St. Luke on the right. And if you look at the composition, the Dionysius of Furna is imitating him almost precisely. There is a problem, however, with Dionysius of Furna, and this is one of the problems. This is one of the reasons why somebody like Constantine Cavernos does not regard Dionysius of Furna as a traditionalist at all, but calls him an innovator. And this is the reason, is because Dionysius includes in his repertoire of painting some elements that are in fact foreign to what prior to the post-Byzantine period. That is to say, we don't see these types of iconographic compositions in what we call traditional Byzantine art. For example, Theophan of Crete, being influenced a little bit, quite a bit actually, by the Western influences that were happening on Crete at that time, represents what is a non-traditional depiction of the Nativity, with the Theotokos having her hands crossed in front of her, and this is the adoration of the child, that is to say, adoration of Christ. Dionysius of Furna misrepresents or misinterprets this imagery. he describes in his Ερμηνεία the scene that he paints here in his own icon as the Theotokos laying the Christ child into the manger, right? In fact, he was not aware of a major iconographic theme, I suppose, of the Theotokos presenting the Christ child to Joseph, and which in the West was quite popular. He was not aware of it, so he had to think of what this represents, and it writes down in the Ερμηνεία the Theotokos is laying the Christ child into the manger. Panselinos and others, in fact, had presented what is more of a traditional form, and though this is a depiction from Panselinos, because of its poor quality, I'm going to show you a slightly different example, where the Christ child remains in the manger, the Theotokos lays next to him, we have Joseph and the midwife, so, and all their compositional forms as well. So Dionysius here actually deviates from tradition a little bit. He also deviates from tradition in another way. Here, in fact, he represents what is traditionally the Orthodox representation of the Anastasis, the descent of Christ into hell. On the right, I am showing you the resurrection by a painter by the name of Moskos from the 17th century. It is currently located in the Byzantine and Christian Museum in Athens. And this is a representation of the resurrection. And at that time, both Cretans and other Orthodox people were painting both iconographic representations. In fact, you can sometimes see both of them represented on one panel. And it's a panel that's divided, and you have the Anastasis and you also have the resurrection. The Anastasis is the traditional Byzantine, or in the oeuvre of Byzantine art, we see the Anastasis and not the resurrection. But they're starting to combine that. Even though Dionysius paints the Anastasis, in the Ερμηνεία, he includes directions of how to paint one and the other. So he had kind of combined that. And we also see in Dionysius' Ερμηνεία references to how to paint compositions that do not appear at all in the Byzantine tradition. This is, for example, I'm showing you on the very left, The Four Horsemen by Hans Holbein the Younger. It's a woodcut that was published in 1523. In the middle is another woodcut published in 1534. And all these woodcuts are making their way to Mount Athos to the west. And then there's also The Four Horsemen in the refectory of Dionisio Monastery, painted by monks who are imitating what they see in these woodcuts that are making their way to Mount Athos. So also here's another example of the opening of the fifth seal, or the fifth angel comes in. On the left we have Melchior Luther's representation from 1522. This is from Luther's September Bible, which are making their way, they're in printed form, they're making their way into Ottoman territory. And also the fresco representation at Dionisio Monastery in the refectory. So Dionysius of Furna ends up utilizing everything that he possibly has, and some of his methods are explained quite well by Paul Hetherington, who notices that in this Triodion of Maximus, who was Bishop of Cythera, that was printed and published in the West and made its way apparently to Mount Athos, the representations of all these poets of the church are then described in the Ερμηνεία exactly as they appear here. Now, obviously, you couldn't tell the colors and those kinds of things as well, but their descriptions match this exactly, which means that he's definitely using this printed material that is coming from the West. So that's the reason why somebody like Constantine Cavarnos talks about Dionysius of Furna as an innovator, somebody who adds and possibly even corrupts Byzantine tradition. However, in the context of the time, at a context when they have lost so much connection to the past, when iconographically and stylistically the artists are making so many compromises on all sides. What Dionysius is doing is in fact something a little bit different. He was actually trying to be very careful and very selective in what he includes in his Ερμηνεία. We have one letter that survives in which he writes to a friend, a priest of his, asking whether in the representation of the ascent or descent of the Holy Spirit, if at the bottom he should depict a representation of cosmos, the world. Sometimes you've seen perhaps the icons that have the bearded man and holding, sometimes he holds a scroll that says cosmos on it. And he's confused because he's seeing examples that do have that and don't have that. And so he asks his friend, should I include that? The priest thinks about it and we have a return letter. And that says, no, I don't think it's a good idea to include that. And it seems that Dionysius ignored that advice because he went along with an example from Manuel Panselinos that did include the depiction of cosmos, and his own icon, which I don't have here to show you, but his own icon includes the depiction of cosmos. So he was very careful to try to solicit advice, but he did not indiscriminately apply it. He also thought about it and thought to himself, which examples am I really going to follow? What Dionysius is trying to do, in fact, or let me put it in this way, as the culture is hemorrhaging and dissipating, and as so many influencers are coming through, somebody needs to come and stop this bleeding out, this dissipation of culture. The way to stop it is to codify everything you can get your hands on first. Later we can talk about, filtering through what belongs and what does not belong. But at the moment, he is trying to include everything that he can get his hands on, precisely because at that moment, in the moment of confusion, at the moment when tradition is being forgotten, in the moment when artists are picking up brushes and they don't have good examples, he is trying to provide them with a comprehensive encyclopedic overview, precisely so that that can be codified and therefore be available for, again, reconstitution by the artists. It is difficult for us to look back and determine, are they themselves engaging in a kind of cost of compromise? When I had mentioned the new and innovative way that the monks started to depict monastic life in an iconographic form with the depiction of Saint Ephraim, there's a question inherent there. Are they doing the right thing? Are they following tradition? They are not following tradition, but they are preserving something that they need to preserve in order to have that tradition at all accessible to them. In this case also, Dionysius of Fernes is going beyond tradition. That's of course true, but he's doing that in the service of tradition. He is employing a modern method. The treatise on art is in fact a modern endeavor. It's a modern form of recording or telling painters how to paint. It was not available. The Byzantine artists themselves never had such a codified example to work with. These people worked from memory, from learning from each other. It was mostly, like I said, a family business, painting icons. And therefore, we have to ask seriously, are they part of the cost of compromise? Or are what they are doing, both the anonymous painters and Dionysius of Fernes, is trying to answer back and push back against the cost of compromise that is going on around them as well? And so, at the very last portion of today, what I will finish on is this wonderful example that comes to us from the Church of the Annunciation from Moldavia. And a colleague of mine had written a really great paper on this particular subject, which is the siege of Constantinople, that is represented here on a fresco. We can see it in the very bottom portion. The entire church is quite magnificently painted on the outside as well as on the inside. And so on the outside we see the painted Akathistos hymn, and part of that hymn is the siege of Constantinople. And here is the representation of it. There's a little bit of a problem here for art historians because we don't quite know which siege this represents. At first, the very immediate answer is this represents the siege of 1453. However, there are details that do not correspond to the siege in 1453, precisely because some of these elements, like we have the mandilion, the sash of the Theotokos, the maphorion of the Theotokos, and the icon of the Odegythria. These were items that were stolen, of course, by the Crusaders and no longer were available in Constantinople at this time when the Ottomans besieged the city. Proposals have been made that this is the Avar and Persian attack of 626 involving Emperor Khosroes II. And the reason for that is because this was quite popularly represented, so other depictions in other Moldavian monasteries in fact have a closer iconographic depiction of that particular siege, and they have inscriptions in which say it is the siege of 626 between the Avars and the Persians. Also, so the painters over here essentially are using that iconography as well. It could also be the Arab siege of 717, and especially the siege of Constantinople in 860 by the Slavs from Rus, especially because the Saint Photios has in his hands the maphorion, which he dipped into the sea, that made it possible for Constantinople to survive the siege. In fact, what Alice Sullivan proposes is that this is a perpetual siege of Constantinople. It conflated, or included, I should say, all of the elements from the different sieges of Constantinople, especially the ones, successful ones, where the Theotokos interceded on behalf of the Christians and saved the city. And that makes sense, of course, in context of the Akathistos hymn, in which we pray to the Theotokos for salvation. And in this way, implied, but I'll go a little bit further in saying this directly on behalf of Alice Sullivan, is to say that what the people here are representing is representing themselves as Constantinople, the eternal city, the city that is always under attack. They are both looking backwards in time, and they are also looking forward in time. They are seeing themselves as always Constantinople, as always being under attack. This is our identity, right? And so, and therefore, we can see that the siege of Constantinople, though we think of it as one single event, in fact can be exploded and used as an identifying marker for all those people who see themselves as having ties to that event because of our shared history in Orthodoxy. And finally, I'd like to conclude with this quote. We've been through quite a lot in the past 3 days, covering both the way that Byzantium has been misrepresented in the West. We talked about the different ways that it had been maligned. We also talked about the ugly history of how the Romans themselves ended up turning on their own culture. And today we saw how people from among this dissolution of their culture started to stop the dissolution themselves in order so that in the future others can pick up at that point and reconstitute Orthodoxy, which is precisely what happened with the work of Simeon of Thessaloniki, as I had explained to you, and the same thing with monasticism, which eventually returned on Mount Athos, and also with artists who continue today to use the painter's manual of Dionysius of Furna. I'm sure that the book is located in the monastery painting rooms. So with that, I will also end with this quote from Maria Todorova, she writes about the Balkans, and she's a great scholar who understands and explains how it is that the Balkans came to be, and in the book Imagining the Balkans, in the dedication to that book, she writes, "To my parents, from whom I learned to love the Balkans without the need to be proud or ashamed of them. And I propose that it is possible for us to look back at our history with all its complications, with both those people who brought devastation upon it and all those people who tried to resurrect their own traditions and to preserve them, to look upon them, to look at this history and this culture with love without necessarily needing to feel proud or ashamed of that culture. On this note, I will end the lecture series, I suppose, not just the lecture itself today, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I think I speak for everybody to express our admiration for your ability to integrate your background and expertise as an art historian, sharing with us many artifacts and icons, while simultaneously employing your pedagogical skills and abilities to put together your own visual displays. So modern visual culture is the PowerPoint or the presentation, and over the past 3 days you've done a magnificent job of sharing with us about some of Byzantium's own untold or little known story. So for that I'm very grateful. At this point in time we will be having our concluding question and answer session. If you are joining us live, you can submit your questions by sending an email to ask@spots.edu. For those here in the audience, Seraphim will be handing out the microphone. Before we go on to the question and answer, I would like to share earlier on the first day there was a question about the 3 books that anybody should have in their library. Now this isn't necessarily a full book, it's a small monograph published here by the Center for Traditionalist Orthodox Studies by the ever memorable Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Etna. It's entitled Constantine the Ethnomartyr, Last Emperor of Byzantium, who is commemorated today, as well as the fall of Constantinople. If you're interested in learning more specifically about Constantine the Ethnomartyr, I would encourage you to purchase this short monograph. So, thank you. Thank you, Seraphim. Wow. Thank you again. Today's presentation, especially with again you bringing your expertise of art history and showing us these examples, really adds another dimension that I guess for most of us wouldn't be accessible if we were just to sit and read a book. So
yeah, absolutely. You know, these examples are all problematic in their own way. As I had just mentioned, you know, Constantine Cavernos, the way that he thinks of Dionysius of Furna, and it takes the understanding of the context. And I had to dive into it very deeply to understand just what they had to deal with, and that highlights their character. And it's one of those reasons why it is so important to, in fact, pay attention to all those things that are going on before making a conclusion about someone like Dionysius of Furna, who was a very complicated artist or painter, icon painter, and a very complex author of the Irminium. And so I was very happy that this comes at the very end of a long series of, or this series of talks where some of the context could be highlighted.
Yes, we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, thanks for the excellent conclusion. I really enjoyed it along with the other two. A question that came to my mind towards the end of the presentation when you were talking about Dionysius of Pharna, about his sort of traditionalizing style of painting, it has to do with, I guess, to what degree at that time and even later and before did iconographers and maybe people working in other arts or writing see themselves as explicitly being traditionalist, if that makes sense. So I know in the present day, for example, when somebody works on icons, we, or at least I, am taught to see icons as an ancient thing from the past that we bring to live today. Mm-hmm. However, at the time, for example, farther back than what you're discussing in something like the 800s or 900s, when the iconographic depiction of the time was essentially the standard depiction for religious subjects, I wonder if then, for example, was there a self-consciously traditionalist view of iconography? When and how did that develop, and what effect did that have on these depictions or on the way that iconography and other arts were produced?
Yeah. The painters who are painting for Venetian audiences in Crete are very aware of the Byzantine past, what looks old and antiquated to them, and precisely because the market is demanding from them the imitation of something old and antiquated, and it is perceived as out of date. In fact, Panayotis Doxaras himself, while promoting modern, what he thinks or he promotes as modern painting methods, by translating the Trattato della Pittura of Leonardo, he is in fact several centuries behind Western Europe. Right? So at the same time, while they have a good understanding of looking back in time, they are still trying to find their place in a new world that just hasn't carved out a space for them, and they need to do it on their own. On Mount Athos, however, Dionysius is very often seen as a traditionalist. What he seems to have done is homed in on a particular style of painting, the one exemplified in the Protothon Church. He says that this is the ideal that we should all go towards. Now, whether he thought of that as being traditionalist, you know, I just showed you one of the examples of what the monks were painting around that time and some of the more severe styles, right? I don't know that they could have identified one as being traditional, the other not. And then of course, you know, formulating a painter's manual is not itself a traditional practice, right? So it's difficult to say what Dionysius might have thought of himself as a traditionalist, but what he did, it seems to think of himself as someone who was promoting the correct way of painting. And there happens to be one that looks back in time, to a very particular time, and therefore corresponds to a tradition. But what he thought was, he was on what he thought was the correct trajectory. That was his aim.
Okay.
We have a question from the audience of sort of on a similar subject, or that does iconographic execution have canonical or dogmatic rules that it must follow to be considered an icon?
Excellent question. And it gets us right back to the understanding of transmission of this culture. Adolphe Napoleon Diderot visited Mount Athos in the 18th century, saw the copy that a painter there was using of, or this was a little bit later in fact, but he saw a copy that a painter on Mount Athos was using of Dionysius' manual, and thought, there is the answer to how Byzantine art as a whole remains consistent throughout all these centuries. They used painters' manuals. And he thought he had answered the problem that a lot of art historians had on their minds, how does it stay so consistent? How is it, well, this is also perpetuating the myth of the, they resisted innovation and so on and so forth, right? But how is it that artistic world stay unchanged for so long? And Diderot thought, I got it. And he published his French version of the Irminia with a preface in which he explains that this is the answer. Of course, we look back and there's no canonical written source that fully articulates the canons of paintings. What we understand, therefore, is that those people passed it on as a matter of like lineage, the way you pass on a craft from father to son. And interestingly, the theology stayed within those circles. They must have lived out their lives in which they knew the theological components of their work very well. They must have all developed and held on to a style. It might have been a regional style, but they also, because they traveled around and painted different churches, they saw other examples, they imitated the forms, and amazingly enough, they did it all without having to write it down. That's as far as we know in terms of that answer. But there was a lot of speculation before we settled on that particular answer.
Yes, Father.
Thank you for the very illuminating lecture.
Thank you.
I have, you mentioned at the very start of the lectures about General Belisarius and his blinding. I was wondering if you could comment on the view of a couple of Greek historians that the act of blinding actually usually involved scorching the cornea to create very dark cataracts. And then, of course, off to the monastery they went. Rather than literal there are some cases where we have literal blinding, gouging the eyes out, and subsequently the person died from those injuries. I was wondering if you could comment on that theory, which I've heard a couple times.
The theory that only one or the other method was used?
No. Usually scorching the cornea was...
I think it's plausible. But I wouldn't know exactly how we would figure out exactly what they did. From the descriptions, I think it's plausible that there were these two methods.
Especially if you consider a political environment where many of these occur.
Yeah.
Politically, diplomatically, you want to be able to see the other person and read their visage and read their reaction to what you're saying. And that's taken away with very dark cataracts, essentially.
Yeah, I wonder too if because they needed different, they were all sometimes motivated by different things. Sometimes they didn't want to cause harm, but that's what the situation called for. So they probably must have developed ways to blind people that were more painful, less painful, or I imagine that it's very painful either way, but one that does more damage, less damage, something that completely disfigures someone's face. And I don't remember exactly those episodes, but I have read something from a history where there was a poor victim of a blinding who the blinding went so wrong that person became mangled in all kinds of ways, and it was partly the intent to in fact devastate that person's life beyond the blinding itself. And so I can imagine all kinds of things were going on. But I don't know too much about blinding techniques.
We do, but just on the topic of the importance of eyes and blinding, I would like to encourage everybody. I suppose most everyone here present has watched or was here when you gave a previous public lectures titled "Thinking with Eyes," a public lecture, but that also discusses sort of the importance of eyesight, both from a spiritual and from an artistic and sort of the Byzantine thoughts about eyesight and vision, particularly compared to the West. So I would encourage our online audience to also take their time to watch that. That's also available on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in eyesight, Father, and vision,
As I said, it was an illuminating lecture.
Sarah from
Okay. I just want to try to articulate this, my point of departure being a little bit more on the art historian side. You know, and theology and art history meeting in the prototype. So what comes to mind throughout your talks was the importance of the prototype and how the erosion of the prototype is still happening. It's still happening. So as traditionalist Orthodox, we revere the prototype, and the sort of the standard bearers are coming from our theological trainers, our monastics, the priests, the bishops, the archbishops. So I guess I'm trying to formulate a question here rather than a comment, that, you know, there still is, like you were talking about, that the fact that the monks then had to paint their own monasteries at a certain point. Did they utilize prototypes from whom? Oh, Father goodness. Did they utilize the prototypes from the monasteries in Byzantium previously, or where did those painters, the icon painters, come from that no longer were available to paint the monasteries? How did that transition?
Well, yeah, the transition. Well, the transition. There was a dip in activity. And the dip in activity corresponded with heavy taxation of the monasteries, and this is when a lot of the church buildings and the buildings of the monasteries fell into ruin and disrepair. And in the process of repairing, and therefore needing to, new plaster was placed on the walls, and there was a need for painting. And most painters had by that time left the Ottoman territories. They could find very little employment. Some of them were employed in Ottoman palaces, but employment was much better procured in territories outside of the Ottoman Empire. But they had a lot of models. They had models from precisely those old churches that had now been destroyed, or in disrepair, and as they're repairing them, they do see these frescoes. They start to uncover these frescoes where they had been covered with dust or debris or something else. And they're uncovering the ruins of a past age, and it is inspiring to them. And they, all of a sudden, there's a frenzy of icon painters on places like Mount Athos, where we have with decades, we have an increased, manyfold, the amount of painters that are recorded in records on those kinds of monasteries, where you'd have monks' names and then zoograph written afterwards, and that just starts to proliferate more and more. It seems that, I'll venture a guess, but it seems that in recovering something of the past, they also saw something of that as kind of a righteous endeavor. It almost becomes like a duty that is on a spiritual level to recover the past and go back to the way that monasticism used to be. So I would venture a guess that something of that sort is going on in their mindsets at that time.
And I also, just as a corollary here, it seems to me that the hand of providence in turning back the prototype back to the monastic community is providentially a blessing to a certain extent. It's still going on in terms of, I see the art world rejects a prototype. Originality is what it's all about, okay? So I think that it's, like I say, God is good to us in that turning it back to people that have theology at the core of their being is a providential thing for art history.
I agree, absolutely. And the modern market or the modern art is dominating by economics of it all. They were not dominated by that. They had little means to do what they needed to do, and they had to go on their own pilgrimages, or not pilgrimages, but they had to go out looking for donations, so a lot of these monks would leave monasteries and would travel, usually north to Russia, and they would be gone from their monasteries for years, sometimes decades. And by the time that they came back, the monastery could have been very different. But these monks had that duty of traveling all over. Sometimes they never came back, unfortunately. Either something happened along the way, or they found another monastery or something of that sort. And it was a time when they needed to figure out what it means to be a monk. And art seems to be part of that.
Thank you.
We have a question from our online audience, specifically to icons from the earliest 20th century and prior, and asking if you can comment on the trade of Orthodox iconography in the retail market, such as auctions, retail art studios, and basically the ownership of icons as common art instead of pious devotional items.
Yeah, I would encourage you to read some of the work by Wendy Salmond. She has done a lot on the way that Russian art has made its way into the United States. And aside from that, if we're talking about early on, the Venetian merchants did a lot to take Orthodox art, or art produced by Orthodox painters in places like Crete, and sell it off in Italy. It seems that what was going on is that in Italy, very wealthy people had possessions of those actual relics of Byzantium, and would be able to display that as antiquities, but also possibly tied with that kind of very old relic of the past. Anybody who wanted to imitate that culture of those who are wealthy could buy for themselves an imitation version of a relic of the past by purchasing one of these paintings that are contemporary but painted in a style that was understood as antiquated. We see Vasari ends up writing about that as he's the father of art history, so he writes about that as there were Italian painters who moved away from the crude style of the Greeks, and he does not have good things to say about that particular style of imagery. And this is where the idea of the progress, that the more naturalistic something looks, the better the quality and so on starts to build in the West. And eventually the Venetian market in icons just dwindles. And at that point, the icon production on Crete also is in trouble, essentially, economically. Well, there's more to say, but on those two, in terms of the modern day and after the Soviet Union, and in terms of the early period, that's what we see on either end of that chronological spectrum.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from the online audience, and then if we have any questions from here locally. So thank you for your lectures, but is there, if you could, the question is asking if you could again explain the thread linking the three lectures. Is there a main idea? I listened as carefully as I could, and I thought I understood sections of each one, but I'm not clear on an overall message.
Yeah. I suppose that the linking thread here is how did this culture get to us today? And it's a question about, in the first lecture we saw its representation historiographically, how people had thought about the history of Byzantium. Then we looked at the problem of dissemination. A lot of things, if you go to Italy and you see those artifacts and you see those statues that have been transported from Byzantium, we know now what story was involved in the way that they appeared in the West. But also, there's a question about what makes, there's a question about who contributed to this dissemination. And so we also saw that there were people who, in fact, compromised their own culture. And so that's a very important part of the history of how that culture gets here. It needed saviors. It needed people who actually worked against the trend of dissolution. And today was a kind of like a second, the first lecture was kind of an introduction. The two now combine together, the second and the third lecture to combine together to first feel the problem. Then the problem was culture was being disseminated. I say the word dissemination. What I mean is the disillusionment of the culture. It's collapse. It's breaking up, right? And then, and so that presents a problem because it wasn't just foreign powers. It was also entities within the culture itself who contributed to it. And the solution to this problem is presented today. Those people who actively did things against the trend of complete dissipation of the culture to try to preserve it in, and their form was, it's kind of archival. Their form of doing so is to compile things, to codify them, right? And therefore, the way that we get these things today is through them. So it's really about how is it that we are in touch with the culture of the past, especially one that we claim to be so connected to.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of questions here from our online audience, but do we have anything here locally? Okay, well then I'll try to summarize to some extent both questions and comments that seem to be coming in on the same topic. Okay. But first, a message of appreciation was sent in for the nuanced presentation of the causes of the fall of Constantinople, especially the answers and thoughts given during the Q&A last night, that things aren't so easily put into simplistic categories. And you know, on the sort of similar topic about the fall of Constantinople, there are questions about, you know, here it writes that my family has drawn parallels, especially in light of the concept of the perpetual siege. Mm-hmm. And we pray to the Mother of God, we thy city dedicate, because as you point out, we are the city under attack. So when we connect the dots of the history of our church, we realize there's something of a pattern. Constantine fell as the people rebelled against the God-appointed emperors and turned to self-dissolution, seeking false union with the Latins. Eventually, Third Rome fell, being the Russian Empire, as the people sought philosophies of the Germans and rebelled against the emperor, and so on and so forth. And what lessons do we, who are defending against ecumenism, or you know, what are the lessons learned from this concept of self-dispossession? Okay, perhaps as the church, as the Orthodox Church, we don't have the city of Constantinople, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a danger in spiritual self-dispossession? And like, so what are the lessons? What lessons can we draw about, you know, defending against ecumenism as sort of the world orthodoxy is increasingly straying away from the truth?
Oh, I think that's, well, I think it says it right there. The comment together with the question points out that there's almost kind of like I call it a spiritual entropy that seeks to dissolve essentially our spiritual bastion, if you wanted to use, you know, the connection with the city, and therefore the work to defend it, if I were to use that phrase, the work to keep it, to upkeep it, to pass it on to future generations, and to therefore to also study it and to learn about it so that we can more accurately and more productively preserve it and ensure its preservation for future generations is of paramount importance. The fight has never been over in that sense.
Okay. Are there, yes?
This is just a practical question. Could you possibly
I'm sorry,
offer-
can you?
Sorry,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry. Matthew, could you give us a reading list? Is there, for those of us at the seminary, a list of books that you've referenced in your 3 talks here?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Okay.
The compilation the bibliography is
A
very
lot.
wide.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a place to start, there's a few exhibition catalogs that I think are quite good. So if you're looking at this period in particular, I would recommend the exhibition catalog titled Post-Byzantium, the Greek Renaissance.
Okay.
And it has a great explanation of what happened generally in this time period, with very great examples of icons and other things of material cultures, not just icons as well. Also, they show some frescoes and things like that. So on the art side, I would say that that's an excellent book. And like I said, the book of Sir Stephen Runciman, The Church in Captivity, is an excellent book. I would recommend to anyone. And I can think of a few others, but I would perhaps start there.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you. I don't know if you attach that to your talks,
Yeah,
So
well, I
reading.
do have a bibliography I can
Okay.
share, absolutely,
we
no
would like
problem.
that, those of us at the seminary. Thank you.
Okay, well, unless there's any final questions from our audience, I'd like to once again express our gratitude for you taking the time and preparing this lecture series and taking on the formidable task of condensing and presenting all this information in a way that fit within a limited time frame.
Yeah.
So I again am very grateful for that. I know that you are involved very much, in addition to just simply teaching at the seminary, with specifically with your expertise as an art historian, specializing in the Byzantine era, and I can, clearly with a love and interest in iconography. If you could speak a little bit about what your thoughts are about the iconography certificate program, which the seminary offers, that is being taught here locally by monastics within the context of a school,
Yeah.
and sort of your own involvement in that, and how you see that as maintaining or sort of building up our cultural and our heritage that we have as Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, I would highly recommend. I'd like to promote the certificate program. We had just mentioned the need to work on preserving this. If we simply do nothing, we think that at the very least, there's nothing that we're not doing anything positive. We're not doing anything negative. In fact, spiritual entropy is kind of like a phrase that suggests that if we simply stand still, we're in fact moving backwards. We're forgetting. We are letting things fall into decay. And our children are developing and growing and learning beyond us in that case. So we in fact can never stop growing, developing, and especially learning about our own culture and theology and all those things that comes with a Christian education. So I would say that as part of this work, I would highly recommend and ask that those who are interested in any form of art, painting, those kinds of things, who are inclined in that direction, to see if you can sanctify those skills with the skill of painting icons, and therefore to combine maybe perhaps personal interests with something that is beneficial not just for the church and the preservation of this wonderful skill and ability to paint icons, but also, as I believe, to work for one's soul while doing so, as this is a very enriching activity for the soul itself. So I would highly recommend, even if it's not this program, perhaps there are opportunities elsewhere. This one is quite good, and I think there are facilities that accommodate the learning of painting icons here. There's a wonderful environment for that, so I think that this is a particularly good place to do that, but there are of course others in the world as well, and I would encourage anybody who's inclined in that direction to continue to explore those possibilities as a matter of necessity in a world that is fast dissolving what we have left.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'd also like to express, on behalf of the seminary, our gratitude for all of you who have joined us in person for these past 3 evenings, and all of you that have joined us online, and all of you who have become co-laborers in the efforts of the seminary through your prayerful support that allows for the students, of course, to be here and sort of dedicate years and their time and energy of their life to learn the theology, to learn and grow in their faith, and it has allowed us as well to organize such lecture series as this one. So thank you so much, and if we can have a concluding prayer, Father.
Christ is risen from the dead, from the death by death, and the glory of the truth, restoring life.